over his whole lifetime. Babies are not good at hiking. They're a little harder. So we're gonna start with Moses as a baby, just to recapture a little bit of the story of Moses. How he grew up may give us some insight into why Moses would want to have bug spray in this instance. So, of course, many of you know that Moses' mother put him in a basket. Yeah. Some of you know that she did that in order to protect him, keep him safe. But does anyone remember what the policy was that made him unsafe as a baby? I bet a lot of those, I couldn't hear one of them, but I bet a lot of those answers were right. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, let's even start before that. The word Hebrew comes from an old Sumerian word, aparu. Sounds about the same. And the aparu, that was just the word for nomad or migrant or gypsy or transient. The aparu were the people who lived in the desert, anywhere in the desert, from modern day Egypt to modern day Iran, and they just didn't have a homeland. In some cases, they could move wherever they want and put their tents wherever they wanted in unwanted space. In other cases, they had to flee like refugees because the neighbors didn't want them in the backyard. The Aparu were a class of people, not really a race of people. They were that underbelly of society who just always had to move. They were people who never had land on their own, and part of that meant they probably held on to some of their culture a little tighter, but a lot of that meant that people looked down on them and made policies that made their life more and more difficult. Now, Egypt eventually took it to another level. At one point, Egypt kind of let them come and go. At another point, Egypt decided to conscript the Aparu and to make them work. They said, you have to farm, you have to clean, you have to build, and any great society is built on the backs of cheap labor, right? And that's what Egypt was doing. So what happened here, except when those folks over generations, when they were forced to settle down and work in those menial jobs, as they were forced to settle down, they started going to school. And then the next generation started buying new camels. And they started having like matzah trucks on every corner. And people started to have regular lives. And they started to have stability. And eventually, when the Hebrews had larger families, which should have been good for Egypt, the Egyptians worried that the minority population would get so large that the majority started to be concerned for their own rights. Now, that would never happen in an enlightened country like the U.S., right? Our white men in power start to see women and Latinos and Africans and African Americans and gays and all these people starting to succeed and have ownership over their life and identity and a voice and rights. And they're never worried about simple equality. But beyond higher walls and glass ceilings and don't say gay and never teach the history, worse than any of that, Egypt started making some new policies to protect the majority from the rising minority. And this is how Exodus starts in chapter 1. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now just back up even farther. Joseph was a Hebrew who had ended up there ages ago. This sentence would be like, imagine a new president who did not know Thurgood Marshall, something like that. You know, I could imagine a president who wouldn't know someone like that, but the new king said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase. And in the event of war, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, the Egyptians set taskmasters over the Hebrews to oppress them into forced labor. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. Sounds a lot like today, the kind of jobs that immigrants in America often hold. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. In fact, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, this is painful, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, she shall live." Now imagine, at some point in Moses' life, he's training to be an Egyptian leader, right? He's part of the royal court. And I don't know yet if he knew anything about his Hebrew past, but at some point he would be studying the history of politics, the history of Egypt, the history of where policies came from. And he must have run across this story. And he must have thought, no, that can't be. We can't be ruthless like that. Many of us grew up with this myth of Thanksgiving, and then when we really learned what America did to the indigenous people, no, we never could have done that. At least, we'll never do that anymore. We would never do that again. And I wonder if Moses ran across the rest of that story, where the most oppressed people in that culture used their wisdom and their strength. This is a few verses later in chapter 1. The midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before any midwife comes in." And this is the first time in recorded history that powerful men have no idea how a woman's body works. It's not the last. It'll happen a lot more in the next 4,000 years. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. But then Pharaoh commanded all the people, not just the midwives, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw in the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." And at some point, Moses, if he heard this, somewhere in the back of his mind, he must have struggled and thought, the things that I have learned are not true. My leaders are not as good as I thought. My life plan might not be as noble as I thought. And you wonder when Moses went further and even considered his name. Now, some of you, what does the word Moses mean? Anyone know? All right, you're going to get to learn. It's a trick. It's a double entendre. This is one of those cool Bible things where there's like a secret message and then a secret message under the secret message. In Egyptian, you're going to know what it means. You've heard of Ramses, like King Ramses is one of the, anyone who's had history, Ramses. Okay, so Ramses is the son of Ra. Ra is the sun god. Ramses is the son of Ra. Tutmoses is another one of the Egyptian pharaohs. Tutmoses is the son of Tut. Okay, so Moses means son of nobody. Son of nobody. It's a lot like if you're Irish. Imagine a lot of Irish people have these cool names like Mick Murphy, Mick Millen, Mick whatever. But what if your name was just Mick, just MC? That's all. You're just son of. Or if you're German, maybe your name is like Johnson or Hansen. But what if your name was just son and not the rest of it? So Moses, part of his name in Egyptian is reaching out toward him being an orphan. He's just the son of nobody. But at some point, he might have noticed that his name also carries a Hebrew meaning, drawn out of the water, like to scoop out of the water, which he was, scooped out of the water as a baby. And he must have wondered, is it possible? That story about throwing babies in the Nile, is it possible? I never felt good about the way we treated slaves, but they were always just slaves. But what if I am one of them? What if that's my identity? I thought I was important, but what if I don't matter? Or here's the change. What if they do matter? What if those people deserve dignity? Now we skip ahead. Moses grows up. He stands up for Hebrew slaves. He gets banished. He flees south. He gets taken in by a family. He gets married. He becomes a sheep herder. He sees the burning bush. Charlton Heston says, "Let my people go." It's a great story. And then he goes to save the Hebrews. And we know it should happen smoothly. This whole story about the "let my people go," Moses is the only person in the entire world who has access to speak in the Egyptian court who also cares about the Hebrews. He's the only one in the entire world who can do that. He's also one of the few people who has at least some experience leading sheep through the desert, through the wilderness, finding water. He's also one of the only people in the history of the world who can speak to God face to face. He has these three qualities that come together. It's got to be easy to be able to save these people. But justice takes hard work. When Moses presses Pharaoh, and he does keep pressing, Moses is not making a deal and just letting it be a deal. He did ask for the men to go, and then he asked for the women and the herds to go. Pharaoh saw right through it. When Moses presses Pharaoh to let the people sneak off for a long weekend, Pharaoh adds to their workload. First, you have to work and stay in this place. Then you have to be slaves. Then the babies have these things happening to them. And now Moses, because of his efforts, these people have to not only make bricks, they have to go collect the supplies to make the bricks. Moses is ready to give up, as many of us would be. But in chapter 6, he is emboldened by God's reminder. God keeps reminding him, I'm on your side. We have a job to do. My people are being abused. I need you. I need you to fix it. And that's when things start to happen. First, the Nile turns red. And some of us grew up thinking that that's a special miracle. Great. If you grew up in, none of you, did anyone grow up in Alabama? What is the name of the football team in Alabama? Oh, you don't know what Moses' name means, but you know the Crimson Tide. I see the education. Yeah, it's the Crimson Tide. This is a Crimson Tide. This is what happens in so many places where a natural bacteria, gets in the water and it dyes the water or discolors it red. So Moses says to Pharaoh, doesn't that Crimson Tide look like blood? Doesn't that remind you of the blood of the Hebrews that you are oppressing? You're on the wrong side of this one, buddy. But Pharaoh is not convinced. So as the bacteria in the water starts to die and the red disappears, as happens in Alabama and all over the world, that shifts the oxygen levels in the water, so the fish can't live there anymore, and the frogs can't live in the water, so where do the frogs go? They jump on land. By the thousands, by the millions maybe. They cover the streets, they get into homes, they bounce all over. They're looking for better water, but there is no better water, and so these frogs with no water, they die. And if you have millions of dead frogs and dead fish lying everywhere rotting, it smells great there, but what happens next? Gnats and flies. It must have been just a disgusting time to be around. Billions of insects eating on that. And what happens with billions of insects? Well, you get diseases that work on the livestock and that hurt the people. Now, thank God, we've learned enough that we never have to worry about environmental degradation caused by selfish and brutish leaders. We never have to worry about people suffering from climate catastrophe because of how the powerful people act, except maybe, once in a while. But back to these ancient myths. Moses says to Pharaoh, do you not see what's happening here? You just keep digging yourself deeper and deeper. Can't you see that these natural plagues are shining a light on the plagues of injustice that you are causing with your indifference and your hatred? But Pharaoh is not convinced. So from the rivers to the sky, the Egyptians love their gods of nature. And so maybe when they experience a huge storm with thunder and lightning and hail, maybe that'll get Pharaoh to stop and wonder. And in the text, he does. He finally slows down and thinks about this, at least until the rain stops. He was close, but it's hard to soften a hard heart. So with loads of water on these fields, what does that mean? Well, a lot of new plants. Even the text that Kristen read, the wheat is destroyed, the produce is destroyed, but the weeds start taking off with all that good water. And what happens when plants take off? Well, there's room for bugs. Egypt is used to these plagues. Certainly they know about locusts. You can see swarms today. If you go watch Planet Earth, you can even see this version of this even today. But the story says this is the largest plague in their history. Billions and billions of locusts eat everything in sight. It would be one of the most amazing things to see in the world where you can't even see the ground, and this really happens out there. The only thing more amazing would be a sandstorm, which comes next and blows them into the sea. It must have felt so helpless to see this huge cycle of locusts and then sand after all that had already happened. So finally, Pharaoh leans toward letting the Hebrews go. He almost accepts that he's been wrong and God is right, almost, until, again, he comes to this point, as so many of us do in our life. I have to hold on to what I can hold on to. I have to hold on to whatever strength I have. I have to hold on to whatever power I can muster. I cannot allow all those things to just happen outside of my control. So these storms killed most of the crops, which means there's less food. And if there's less food, you have to ration it out. And in these cultures, if you have to ration it out, who gets it first? The oldest child. And we don't know if the locusts carried disease, or more likely, there was the rain caused some kind of black mold in the stores of whatever food was left over. But the parents who gave the food to the firstborn, those kids got sick and eventually they died. Or one other theory is that a lot of people in the ancient Near East cultures when they were at spiritual desperation, they would offer a live sacrifice. There's very little evidence of this happening commonly, but it happens once in a while. So maybe people just sacrificed their children in some way because everyone was starving. Or what if God is just sick of Pharaoh and sends some angel of death? Either way, finally, Pharaoh says, "Go, I give up." Now, there is a long way from escaping slavery to total freedom. The story as it goes, as Moses takes this hike, there's a whole sea in the way, there's a lot of wilderness in the way, there's figuring out how to be people together, there's figuring out how to get into the Holy Land and be people with others. And in the same way, there's a long space between stopping injustice and creating a beloved community that deserves to be called the kingdom of God. There's a long way to go between erasing broken laws and then creating opportunities to thrive. But in this moment, when Pharaoh is convinced, this is a vital step to start easing suffering. And today, when we are faced with the plagues of injustice, we get to do the same things. We get to be the bug spray when the locusts come. We get to respond to the way that people are hurt. And really, responding to hurts, it's not that hard. We do this all the time. Charity is not that hard. Volunteering is not that hard. Signing petitions is not that hard. What is genuinely hard is then moving on from the plagues to become a healing agent for those who hurt. What is hard is really rehearsing the kind of world that we want to live in and committing to rehearsing that over and over. What is hard is changing the conditions that cause suffering in the first place. What is really hard is changing ourselves so we can see those conditions that hurt others in the first place. When we see those things that bug us, things that overwhelm us, things that stink, things that cause death and disease, when we see the arc of history moving from all of that, we are called to get on board with God. Not to wait for a miracle, not to wait for a superhero like Moses. We are called to join the Spirit of God to resist, to heal, and to recreate new life. So maybe it's not just the bug spray, but it's the aloe that heals, and it's learning how to wear a shirt that the bugs can't get into in the next place. And the point